In a distant and hidden place, far removed from the outside world, children were subjected to a brutal training regime. Suspended upside down by ropes tied to their legs, they endured the relentless torture of searing flames. It was a test of sheer endurance. Some perished in horrifying ways, unable to bear the excruciating conditions. One of the overseeing supervisors coldly announced that number 6 had reached his limit. Without a trace of empathy, he ordered an assistant to dispose of the boy's body. These men, dressed in traditional ninja attire, bore eyes that glowed red with a chilling, emotionless gaze. Another supervisor, observing the group, remarked that the children simply weren't up to the mark. But amid the suffering and chaos, there was one boy who stood apart. Unlike the others, he remained eerily calm and intensely focused, as though he had become one with the heat of the flames. Not a single bead of sweat touched his face. That boy was named Fuuma Kotarou, and he would one day become a legend. The supervisors soon took notice. They agreed that number 8 was the only one who possessed both the resilience and the rare ability to harness fire. Years passed, and Fuuma Kotarou matured into a deadly warrior. In a ruthless battle for survival, he turned against his fellow ninja comrades, cutting them down with his razor-sharp blade. The aftermath of the fight was a massacre. Bloodied corpses strewn across a battlefield that had turned crimson from the bloodshed. The exhaustion was etched into his face, a grim reflection of the brutal combat he had endured. From atop a nearby hill, a high-ranking clan official observed the carnage, flanked by several test supervisors. One of them noted with conviction that the young man had mastered every aspect of the Fuuma ninja arts. The man in the yellow robe gave a wicked smile and declared with certainty that the boy would become the clan's next leader. In the year 1546, Fuuma Kotarou was deployed to the battlefield of Kawagoe. Survival demanded the death of every enemy, and Kotarou delivered. The field was once again littered with the mutilated remains of those who had stood in his way. Among the few survivors of his ninja clan, Kotarou emerged with flames erupting from his hand, a manifestation of one of the clan's most powerful techniques. His face was smeared with blood, and his eyes burned with a singular focus: survival, no matter the cost. From the moment they had entered this world, children like him were considered miracles, beings destined for greatness. They devoted every moment of their lives to relentless training in the forbidden arcane assassination technique. For this reason, the world came to know them by a single, fearsome name: the Husa. After completing another mission, the young warrior returned to the main base of the Fuuma clan, hidden deep within a towering mountain blanketed by dense fog. There, he and his companions bowed respectfully before an elderly man clad in yellow robes, known as Hojo Jinan. Jinan praised their efforts, remarking that the surprise attack they had carried out days earlier had been magnificent. With a wicked smile and cold, unfeeling eyes, he added that his lordship was delighted with their overwhelming victory and that generous rewards awaited them. Turning his gaze specifically to Kotarou, he expressed high expectations for him in the future. The hero, his black hair falling over glowing red eyes, protective gloves covering both arms, and a sword slung across his back, responded with firm loyalty, pledging his obedience without hesitation. With a simple gesture, Hojo Jinan dismissed the squad, granting them permission to leave. In an instant, Kotarou and the two other ninja vanished from sight, leaving only the shifting mist behind. Moments later, a shadowy figure with glowing green eyes emerged from a dark corner of the building. Dressed in a blue ninja uniform, the stranger warned Jinan not to place too much trust in the Fuuma. He explained that the Fuuma were different, even among ninja, extraordinary beings shaped by brutal, almost inhuman training. Wherever they fought, the battlefield was reduced to a grotesque heap of unrecognizable corpses, their ninjutsu surpassing any conventional techniques. Jinan, however, remained unfazed. He calmly assured the figure that there was no need for concern. The Fuuma, he claimed, were bound by an unbreakable rule to serve the Hojo clan. Any who dared defy it would be executed without mercy. With a sinister grin, He added that the entire clan was shackled by this law, calling them wretched creatures, and remarking that there could be no more convenient tool. In 1579, the Battle of Kasegawa erupted. A unit of heavily armored soldiers charged toward the enemy's position, their commander leading them atop a warhorse, a red spear gleaming in his hand. The commander urged his men forward, ordering them to take the enemy general's head and earn glory for themselves. But then, without warning, Kotarou appeared in the midst of the battlefield, halting the commander in his tracks. Shocked at the sight, the commander could hardly believe his eyes. A mere child standing alone on the field of war. Without a moment's hesitation, Kotarou gave the order to his comrades to attack. Gritting his teeth, he summoned his ninjutsu, causing flames to erupt and swirl violently around his body. Then, wielding the fire transformation technique, he struck with terrifying precision, severing the head of the commander's horse in a single blow. Chaos engulfed the battlefield. Soldiers screamed in agony as their bodies melted and crumbled into ash under the searing heat of Kotarou's flames. At that moment, more Fuuma ninjas emerged from beneath the ground, revealing themselves before the stunned enemy. The commander, overwhelmed by horror, found himself unable to strike back. He stood frozen, appalled that his opponents had unleashed children, merciless and unstoppable as weapons of war. Kotarou materialized behind the man, and with a swift, merciless motion of his hand, sliced clean through his head, ending his life in an instant. Above the battlefield, a lone hawk circled, its silhouette drifting through the smoke-choked sky. Kotarou raised his gaze to it, his mind turning inward. To him, killing was everything. It was survival. It was life itself. As long as he lived, he would keep killing. By 1613, the once feared warrior, now 80 years old, was dragged forward in heavy shackles. Broad-shouldered and towering even in chains, Kotarou was paraded through a village as crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the living legend. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. Some spoke with awe, others with terror. One man gawked at Kotarou's sheer size, stunned. Another recoiled, muttering that he was no man but a monster. A woman clutched her child closer, whispering the word demon under her breath. Kotarou had fallen into the hands of the Edo shogunate. The Hojo clan, whom the Fuuma had once served with unwavering loyalty, had long since crumbled, defeated by Toyotomi Hideyoshi during the siege of Odawara. Their hidden village, too, had been wiped from existence. No sanctuary, no legacy, nothing but ruins. Forced to kneel in the dirt, Kotarou prepared to face his execution. A man stepped forward and asked if he had any final words. Kotarou said nothing. Inwardly, he accepted the end. The executioner, trying to steady his nerves, remarked that even a legend could not stand against the weight of time and numbers. He spoke of how the descendants of Higa and Koga clans still found purpose, but when Kotarou lifted his gaze, the man's words faltered, caught in his throat. For a moment, an ancient, primal fear gripped him. As the blade was raised, Kotarou's mind drifted deeper inward. A bitter chuckle echoed in his thoughts. Resigned, yet oddly content. He thought of his withered body, the long road behind him, the countless lives taken. He wondered why death had taken so long to find him. Had Master Kite survived? Was he watching even now, from some distant shadow? Kotarou envied Kite, the freedom he had once embodied. Freedom. A dream Kotarou had chased since childhood. A dream he had lived and killed for, right up to this final breath. The blade fell. Kotarou's head hit the ground with a heavy thud. But as the world faded into black, his eyes suddenly snapped open. Hovering before him was a red, spectral finger pointing directly at his severed head. Stunned, Kotarou tried to comprehend the surreal sight. A mystical hand emerged from the darkness, and a calm, eternal voice spoke, selecting him. From beyond a vast, burning gate, a flaming figure stepped forth, its presence overwhelming. It claimed to see the world through all things, to know the threads of fate. Kotarou's gaze locked onto the inferno beyond the gate. The voice declared that he would live again. A blinding flash of light split the void. The world shifted. A newborn child thrashed against unseen confines, its heavy eyelids fluttering, its lungs gasping for air. Agony filled its cries, desperation gripping its tiny body. Instinct took hold. The infant unleashed a raw, primal power, fire transformation, and with it, a devastating explosion ripped through its prison. The newborn blasted its way free from the body of a colossal dragon, tearing through flesh and bone. Suspended in midair, the infant opened its eyes to a strange and wondrous realm. Below, the dragon's corpse crashed into a castle with a deafening roar, reducing it to rubble and smoke. Through the settling dust, the baby rose unsteadily to its feet and looked around. Strange creatures with green skin, sharp teeth, and pointed ears emerged from the shadows. Demons, perhaps. Kotarou, reborn, lay staring up at a vast, alien sky. His thoughts cleared, sharper than ever. The land was foreign. Flying lizards circled overhead like spirits of the air. And with that realization came certainty. This was reincarnation. After Kotarou tore through the dragon's body, someone below was watching. Her eyes widened in surprise as she saw a baby falling from the sky. At that moment, Kotarou was filled with an indescribable joy. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever felt before. He embraced it fully, his mind racing with the realization that he had been reborn. A sense of liberation surged through him, refreshing and profound. For the first time in his existence, he felt truly free. Nearly a century earlier, the hero Arslan had defeated the demon lord, and he and his companions were celebrated as the four great heroes, immortalized as living legends. But with the rise of a new demon lord, the strength of the demon kin surged. The surface world was gradually consumed by the demon realm, marking the dawn of a new age, an age ruled by the demon kin. In the present, a massive green creature towered over Kotarou, its enormous foot pinning him to the ground. As it looked down, it noticed the infant beneath its foot and furrowed its brow in confusion. A human child having fallen alongside the dragon? It made no sense. The creature, a member of the goblin kin, the Goblin King, scoffed at the sight, dismissing Kotarou as nothing more than a weak, inferior human. With a sneer, he kicked Kotarou across the ground, sending the baby skidding until he landed hard on his back. Nearby, chaos had erupted among the goblins. One shouted to the Goblin King that the Sky Goblin Castle had been completely destroyed. Another cursed their misfortune, calling the wreckage unforgivable. Fueled by rage, the Goblin King suggested they kill the child to vent their frustration, and the other goblins eagerly agreed. Bloodlust rose in the air as they prepared for a brutal execution. The Goblin King raised his weapon and brought it down with full force, intending to crush Kotarou beneath it. The goblins cheered as the weapon smashed into the earth, but when the dust cleared, their cheers faltered. The Goblin King's eyes narrowed in disbelief. Somehow, Kotarou had dodged the blow. Internally, Kotarou exhaled with relief, narrowly avoiding the strike. The goblins stared, dumbfounded, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. A baby had dodged an attack of that magnitude? Kotarou observed his small body. Babies had underdeveloped bones, which made movement difficult. But despite the struggle, he managed to force himself to his feet, his tiny body trembling. The Goblin King stared in disbelief as Kotarou suddenly vanished. In the blink of an eye, Kotarou reappeared on top of the Goblin King's head, twisting its neck in a grotesque and unnatural motion. Without hesitation, he activated a technique ninjutsu borrowed fire. Flames erupted around him, engulfing both him and the Goblin King. The Goblin King screamed as the fire tore through his flesh, but Kotarou held on, refusing to stop the flow of flames. The goblins could only watch in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the sight before them. One goblin, wide-eyed, struggled to understand how a baby could wield such advanced magic. This wasn't merely an advanced fire spell, it was something even greater. Meanwhile, The massive corpse of the dragon lay sprawled across the remains of the sky castle. Steps leading to the ruined structure rose upward, and the woman from earlier began climbing them. As she ascended, memories stirred within her. This place had once belonged to the Elfkin, and the sight filled her with a deep sense of nostalgia. Her thoughts returned to the baby, the one who had emerged from the dragon's belly. She was certain that he was here. When she reached the upper level and looked around, she was met with a gruesome sight. Goblin bodies were strewn across the floor, torn apart in brutal fashion. Her eyes fell on Kotarou, who had collapsed on the ground, exhausted and spent from the battle. She approached slowly, still in disbelief. Could this baby have truly done all of this? Pulling back her hood, her expression shifted from shock to quiet recognition. She whispered to herself, "I've finally found it. A tiny seed of hope." This woman was Hyrie Titania, one of the 4 great heroes, a living legend in her own right. A flicker of memory stirred in Fuuma Kotarou's mind. He recalled a vision of himself as a baby, cradled in his mother's arms, with his father beside her, smiling warmly. The memory was hazy, but the tenderness of the moment unsettled him. Confusion surged as he tried to make sense of what he saw. Then, another image emerged, his birthplace. What had once been a hidden village was now nothing but smoldering ruins. The ashes whispered of a massacre, of death and destruction. Some had apparently remarked on the miracle of a lone infant surviving the carnage. Perhaps it had been fate or the will of a ninja. As the memory deepened, Fuuma heard his own voice echoing in his mind. He questioned whether these memories were truly his. He had been raised in the ninja village with no recollection of parents, no origin beyond the strict discipline and coldness of shinobi life. He had always believed he was alone, that he could rely on no one but himself. So why now, after all this time, was such a memory resurfacing? His consciousness stirred, and he slowly opened his eyes. He found himself staring up at a striking woman, beautiful and well-endowed, who gazed down at him with a look of serenity and care. The realization struck him. He had been reincarnated. He was in the body of an infant. His mind raced. He wondered who she was and where he had ended up. The woman gently wrapped him in her cloak and placed him carefully on a smooth rock before kneeling in front of him. She introduced herself as Hyrie Titania and greeted him by name, Fuuma Kotarou. Hearing his name startled him. He questioned how she could possibly know it. Then she confessed, offering an apology for having delved into his memories without his permission. His mind reeled at the impossibility of it. He wondered what kind of technique could access memories so deeply sealed. But she seemed unbothered by his shock. With a soft and sincere tone, Hyrie had asked if she could stay by his side, acknowledging the limitations of his infant body. She offered her help, saying she would gladly support him in any way she could. Fuuma regarded her silently, analyzing every word. He couldn't help but question her motives. Her offer to help, it sounded kind, but what did she truly want? In the end, however, he decided it didn't matter. If she turned on him, he would kill her without hesitation. In this new and unfamiliar world, trapped in the form of a child, he would use whatever resources he had, her included. With that thought, a faint smile crossed his lips. Hyrie, overwhelmed by the expression, had thrown her arms around him, hugging his small body tightly. She had promised to do her best to support him, explaining that his smile was too adorable to resist. Her joy had been genuine, but in the process, Fuuma found his face buried in her chest, which caused a faint blush to creep onto his cheeks. She quickly apologized, saying she was simply overjoyed. Yet even in that warmth, Fuma's thoughts remained guarded. He wondered again if she was trying to manipulate him. But there was something strange. He could sense no malice, no bloodlust. That alone confused him more than anything. How could someone like her exist? He dismissed the thought. He reminded himself that kindness was a weapon, a way to dull a warrior's instincts. That's how they tried to break him before, to tame him, chain his soul, and mold him into a compliant tool. He wouldn't let it happen again. This time he vowed he would remain free. Sleep began to overtake him, He admitted internally that part of the fatigue came from his small, underdeveloped body, but more than that, there was something else, an unfamiliar comfort. He realized he hadn't felt this safe while sleeping in years. The constant killing intent that had haunted him was absent now. As he lay in Hyri's lap, she looked down at him with a tender gaze. She whispered softly that he wasn't alone anymore, that she was here now, by his side. A flashback then revealed how she had first found him. Hyri had arrived at the Sky Castle after a brutal battle. Goblin corpses littered the ground, their deaths swift and violent. She had been stunned by the carnage and questioned who could have been responsible for such devastation. Upon discovering the infant, she had cast a memory-reading spell. Gently placing a finger on his forehead, she activated the spell and witnessed his memories unfold. She saw his life as a child among ninjas, how he endured constant hostility, how he slept under the gaze of killers, and how he eliminated them without mercy. She saw the moment of his death, and the fierce battle against the Goblin King that followed his reincarnation. She watched as Fuuma sat alone after the bloodbath, the look in his eyes dark and unrelenting. Everything he had endured, every betrayal, every loss, passed through her. And as those memories washed over her, Hyri Titania had wept. Hyri cradled Fuuma Kotarou gently in her arms, her mind awash with reflection. She considered how terrifying it was to live an entire life suppressing one's emotions, a path all too familiar to those raised as ninjas. In that world, even a single mistake or fleeting vulnerability could open the door to the demonkin's corruption. Yet, as she gazed down at the child in her arms, she felt something different. Within him, there was a spark, something unbroken. Despite the solitude that had no doubt marked his previous life, he had never fully surrendered to despair. His spirit had endured, quietly resilient. She saw no killer in him, but rather the heart of a hero. In this life, she told herself, he would know love. He would never again be alone. As she sat upon a stone in the quiet aftermath of battle, the stillness was shattered by movement. The Goblin King, mangled and broken, began to rise once more. His body was twisted and bleeding, limbs askew, armor in ruins. Yet he refused to stay down. Disbelief painted his monstrous features. He could not comprehend how a mere human infant had brought him to this state. Consumed by rage, he prepared for a final attack. But just then, Fuuma Kotarou stirred. His eyes opened, sharp and cold like a drawn blade. Without uttering a word, he raised one small hand. In an instant, a devastating force erupted from him, obliterating the Goblin King completely. Hyri remained unaware of the destruction he had wrought. She simply rocked him gently as he slipped back into slumber, unaware of the calamity that had just passed. Silence returned for a time, until Hyri noticed a creature circling above. Its gaze locked with hers. Acting on instinct, she cast Air Rend, and the beast screamed as it was torn from the sky and crashed to the ground. Immediately, she wrapped herself in her cloak and rose to her feet, her calm fraying with the first signs of panic. It seemed they had been discovered. There was no time to consider alternatives. The safest escape from the demon realm now lay through the forest of the giant tree. Dangerous or not, the Rotwood was their only hope. Meanwhile, in a chamber shrouded in pitch darkness, a magical projection of Hyri appeared. The image hovered before a massive, arcane eye, surrounded by 10 shadowy figures. One of them spoke, reporting that Hyri Titania, the Fairy King, had been found. A low, amused chuckle followed. The demon lord himself responded, intrigued but unmoved. Another voice mocked the report, surprised she was even still alive. Some dismissed it entirely, claiming she was powerless now, no longer the force she once was. But as the projection shifted, revealing the child in her arms, the room fell into silence. They watched as Fuuma Kotarou annihilated goblins with terrifying ease. When the scene showed him obliterating the Goblin King, the tension thickened. Someone whispered doubtfully whether such a being could truly be a baby. Another let out a giddy laugh. Then, the demon lord issued his order. 10 demons were to be sent immediately. Their goal was simple: capture the child and kill the elf. The 10 figures accepted the command without hesitation. Back in the waking world, a violent explosion tore through the forest. Fire raged and trees splintered as Hyri ran through dense terrain, relentlessly pursued by demonic beasts. Her breath came fast, her expression tight with frustration and urgency. She muttered that there were too many of them. In her arms, Fuuma Kotarou's wide eyes gleamed, not with fear, but fascination. The monstrous creatures behind them stirred his curiosity, not terror. She warned him not to get too excited. If he fell now, there would be no recovery. Escape was their only viable path. Then, suddenly, attackers descended from the treetops, silent, swift, and deadly. Hyri reacted instantly, summoning her greatest spell, Grand Air Rupture. The sky itself seemed to tear open as a cyclone of air and energy devoured the creature's midair, leaving nothing behind but drifting ash and feathers. Fuuma watched, tucked safely in her arms, thoroughly impressed. He had never seen a technique like that, not in any village, not in any war. And in that moment, a faint smile crept across his face. In his mind, he acknowledged one truth: this girl was something else. Before Hyri could even finish the thought forming in her mind, a massive creature descended from above, its monstrous shape blotting out what little light remained. Its talons stretched toward them with deadly precision. She was gripped by terror. The threat was far from over. Clutching Fuuma Kotarou tightly to her chest, she silently cursed herself. The strength she once wielded, power that could have ended such a threat with a glance, was gone. Now, fear threatened to freeze her in place. In contrast, Fuma's eyes gleamed with excitement. The looming beast didn't scare him, it thrilled him. Just as the creature lunged, a sudden burst of movement tore through the air. A group of small, winged beings, fairy-like in appearance but bearing a strange, menacing aura, intervened, positioning themselves between the predator and its prey. One among them floated closer to the beast and addressed it in a high, melodic voice. It claimed that the elf and the child were already spoken for, that the creature had no right to them. The massive beast froze, its hunger halted by something in the small creature's tone. Then, without warning, it turned and vanished into the distance. Fuuma stared up at the new arrivals, clearly fascinated. One of the fairy-like beings spun midair and faced them. At first, its face appeared cheerful, almost playful, but then it twisted grotesquely, revealing a demonic snarl. Its voice, dripping with disdain, accused them of trespassing and called Hyri a filthy elfkin. A seething fury radiated from the creature as it prepared to strike. Hyri rose to her feet slowly, tense but composed. She understood now this encounter had been unavoidable. There was no running from it. Meanwhile, Fuuma remained captivated by the inchling creatures, his gaze alight with curiosity. But these were no innocent fairies. The creatures began to shriek in cruel unison, their voices laced with mockery and venom. They called Hyri worthless, scorned her bloodline, and demanded she surrender the child so they could devour her. Before any of them could act, Fuuma had already slipped from Hyri's grasp. He vanished from her arms in an instant, darting upward toward the startled fairies. Without hesitation, he extended his fingers between the legs of several of the winged creatures. Gasps erupted from the group. One cried out in confusion, another in disgust. They called him a pervert, clearly shocked. Hyri's heart leapt in alarm. She searched for him frantically, warning him that these were no ordinary creatures, that provoking them could prove deadly. But Fuuma only laughed, bright and carefree, calling out with delight about the strange flying inchlings. Seeing that unfiltered joy, something stirred within Hyri. That innocent smile, untainted by fear or trauma. It overwhelmed her. For the first time, she felt certain that Fuuma had truly broken free from the loneliness and sorrow that once clung to his soul. But the moment was fleeting. One of the fairies trembled with rage and swore to paralyze him. A green thorn began forming in its mouth, shimmering with poison. It launched the venomous needle at him. Hairi recognized the danger instantly, poison needles. The others joined in, releasing their own deadly projectiles. Fuuma responded instantly. In a blur of motion, he caught each needle with his hands and feet, his expression now cold and focused. The fairies froze, stunned by the impossible speed and precision. Then, without a word, he hurled the needles back at them. Screams echoed through the air as the thorns found their targets. The fairies collapsed one by one, writhing in agony. One of them, in her final breath, murmured in disbelief that such movements couldn't be human. Fuuma landed softly, the tension fading from his frame. A cold sharpness lingered in his gaze. He had only reacted to their killing intent. He always did. But it had ruined his good mood. He rubbed his eyes, quietly thinking to himself how sleepy he suddenly felt. Then, without warning, another massive thorn launched toward him. Before it could strike, Hairi lunged forward and caught him in her arms. The thorn struck her instead. Blood sprayed as she stumbled, the wound ripping into her side. Fuuma looked up at her, wide-eyed, as realization dawned. Hairi faltered and collapsed to the ground. Blood poured from her injury, soaking into the forest floor. She clenched her teeth against the pain and cursed the thorn for grazing her. From nearby, a weak, mocking laugh rang out. One of the wounded fairies still clinging to life. The ground trembled. A shadow fell over them. Something enormous approached, its presence smothering the air around them. Hairi tried to rise, but her body would no longer obey her. Out of the darkness came a towering, grotesque figure, far more monstrous than the others. It hovered effortlessly, its blackened wings wide and eyes filled with ancient malice. Then it spoke, its voice thick with cruel amusement. It addressed Hairi by name, Hairi Titania, as though savoring the sound. She looked up weakly, meeting its gaze. And she knew. This was their mother. Hairi looked up in stunned disbelief. It was Elva, the fairy king. Elva demanded that Hairi hand over the child, her eyes burning with ambition. She declared that once Hairi was dead, she would finally be acknowledged as one of the 10 demon lords. The statement struck Hairi with disbelief. The idea that Elva would align herself with the demon kin was almost too much to comprehend. Before Hairi could respond, Elva cut her off with a roar. With a grotesque motion, she began to pull a weapon from deep within her throat. How it had been hidden there was a mystery in itself. Once the weapon was fully drawn, Elva made it clear she no longer took orders from the Elfkin. Then she attacked. Hairi barely managed to evade as Elva's venom blast tore through the forest, obliterating a tree behind her. Elva mocked her resilience, explaining that her venom was so concentrated it could melt through anything, and she promised that the next blow would be fatal. Landing on the ground, Hairi's determination surged. She vowed she would never hand over Kotarou. The baby, still cradled in her arms, looked up at her with wide, dazed eyes. Without hesitation, Elva unleashed her next move, what she called the Fairy King's Grand Sword Dance. A massive explosion erupted, devastating the surrounding area. But just before the destruction reached Hairi, Kotarou raised a single finger and stopped the attack in its tracks. A strange sensation swept through Kotarou. In that moment, he admitted to himself that he couldn't bring himself to abandon this girl. Now face to face with the child, Elva stared in complete shock. The baby had stopped her attack with just one finger. It suddenly became clear to her. This was why the demon kin wanted the boy. He wasn't an ordinary child. Meanwhile, Kotarou lamented the limitations of his body. It lacked stamina, but for a technique of that level, he could manage. Then he launched his own counterattack, ninjutsu, finger sever. The technique cut cleanly through Elva's body. Blood spewed from her mouth as she staggered backward, too stunned to comprehend what had just happened. Before Kotarou could finish her off, Hairi stepped in, pleading for him to stop. She asked him not to kill Elva. Elva, barely able to stand, questioned her motives. Hairi responded with conviction. She wanted to save her. Kotarou looked up at Hairi as she began to speak of the past. Once, the Elfkin and the Fairykin had lived in peace, sharing a bountiful land called the Forest of the Giant Tree. The Elf King and the Fairy King had formed an alliance. Elfkin governed with wisdom, while Fairykin defended their home with strength and numbers. But, Hyrie explained, the alliance had a darker truth. The Fairykin had been used, seen as inferior in intelligence and culture. Over time, resentment had grown. Eventually, war erupted. Hyrie had been a child then, powerless to stop anything. Kotarou, reflecting on his past life, noted that such dynamics were common across every world. There were always those who used others and those who were used. And yet, here stood a girl, still burning with conviction, even after all she'd seen. When Hyrie revealed the war had occurred only 150 years ago, Kotarou was taken aback. Was this girl older than him? What kind of world was this? Elva, meanwhile, dismissed the tale. She called it an old, rotten story. As she spoke, her form began to shift. She claimed the poison should have already begun affecting Hyrie. She was ready to kill her, ready to ease the centuries-old regrets of the Fairykin by ending the life of an Elfkin princess. Hyrie cried out desperately, insisting that continuing the conflict would lead only to more destruction. But Elva wouldn't be swayed. She screamed that this was her mission. Once, during the war, she too had been a princess. That the two surviving royal heirs should meet again in battle was destiny. She had to fulfill it by killing Hyrie. Then, with a flash, the magic rune around Elva's neck activated. Hyrie recognized it instantly. It was a contract seal. She was horrified. Elva had made a pact. Elva confirmed it calmly, saying that they were in the same position now, and Hyrie should understand. The power flowing through her, she explained, had been granted by the demon lord himself. A long-forgotten memory stirred in Hyrie's heart, a moment from her and Elva's childhood. They had once wandered together beneath the ancient canopy of the great forest, in a time untouched by war. The air had been calm, the world peaceful. Hyrie had once asked Elva why conflict never seemed to end. Why the human-kin, demon-kin, and beast-kin continued to battle, even though they were all simply living beings trying to survive. She had spoken of hope, of a future where Elfkin and Fairykin could coexist, where the forest would remain unscarred by violence. Elva had reassured her with a gentle smile, promising that everything would be all right and that the forest would protect them. Her words had sparked a fragile light in Hyrie's eyes. Elva had reminded her that they would always be friends. At that moment, Hyrie had paused, touched by the sincerity, and then returned the smile. But the warmth of that memory faded. In the present, Elva was transforming, her voice rising in manic intensity as she proclaimed the power of the demon-kin now coursing through her, granted by the demon lord himself for one purpose: to kill Hyrie. Hyrie watched in pain as her childhood friend disappeared beneath the weight of corrupted magic. She recognized the glowing contract seal on Elva's skin and realized, with horror, what Elva had done. She had accepted the demon lord's mark, giving herself over as a weapon. Hyrie had preserved her own power for one person, someone precious, someone she had sworn to protect. But now, for Elva's sake, she was willing to break that seal. Elva had laughed, mocking Hyrie's silence. She had asked if she was too scared to speak, then screamed for her to die, unleashing her deadliest technique: Fairy King's Grand Sword Dance. Crucifix. The explosion that followed was catastrophic, shaking the land and splitting the forest asunder. Elva's laughter had echoed across the destruction. She believed Hyrie had been reduced to ash. But then, magic had begun to swell from the center of the crater. A sphere of radiant energy pulsed with light, and from it, Hyrie had emerged, transformed. Divine wings unfurled from her back, glowing with sacred power. The magic she had sealed away for so long now flowed freely. Elva had recoiled in disbelief, overwhelmed by the sheer magical pressure pressing down on her. She had thought Hyrie's strength had been lost long ago, but it hadn't. Not entirely. Hyrie had moved with calm precision, casting 2 spells: complete status recovery and full stamina restoration. Her wounds vanished, her vitality returned. Kotarou, nestled in her arms, stirred. The heaviness that had clouded his body lifted, and confusion replaced the haze in his eyes. Elva had stared at them in shock, whispering that it couldn't be. A Heil-class spell? She realized then that this power belonged only to one person, the great sage, Hyrie Titania. Hyrie had lifted her hand, calm yet resolute. She had declared that she wouldn't fight Elva, that she would save her. With that, she cast freezing sacred stigmata. The divine beam struck Elva directly in the chest. The demonic aura around her began to unravel and disperse. She stood motionless, wide-eyed, as the corrupted power dissipated. Hyrie had spoken softly then. She had told Elva that she was no longer bound by anything, that there were more important things to protect. Lives, peace, friendship, not vengeance or ancient regrets. Elva's eyes filled with tears. Memories overwhelmed her. The war, the loss, the path that had led them to this moment. She remembered when it had all gone wrong, when she had listened to the wrong voices, tempted by power and revenge. Kotarou had risen to his feet and extended a hand toward her. Moved by the warmth in Kotarou's smile, she hesitated, then slowly began to reach back. But before their hands could meet, a violent force crashed down from above. A figure descended like a meteor, slamming Elva into the ground with brutal force. Kotarou stood frozen in disbelief. The attacker surveyed the scene with disdain. With scorn in his voice, he mocked Elva's fall. To receive a bestowal seal from the demon lord, only to end up like this? Pathetic, he said. What a boring end. Apu, one of the 10 demon generals, stood triumphantly atop Elva's motionless body, her laughter erupting in twisted delight. The expression on her face revealed how much she relished seeing her opponent in agony. For her, this was bliss. Hyrie's power had begun to surge, her fury intensifying as she took in the horrific scene. Kotarou had remained frozen in place, eyes wide with shock at what had just transpired. Apu had continued to smirk, commenting mockingly on Elva's condition. She had noted aloud that the body transformation caused by the contract seal was spiraling out of control, something she believed Elva was clearly incapable of handling. Driven by rage, Hyrie had drawn even more magic into herself. Without hesitation, she had activated a transfer spell and instantly teleported both Kotarou and Elva to her side. Wasting no time, she had cast a powerful incantation, Karmic Inferno Annihilation, and unleashed it with overwhelming force. A colossal blast of magical energy had torn through the surroundings, igniting the battlefield in a blinding explosion. As the dust began to settle, Hyrie had hovered midair, panting heavily from the tremendous energy she had expended. Elva had floated beside her, unconscious, while Kotarou drifted nearby, his expression filled with barely contained rage. Yet, even after such destruction, Apu had remained completely unharmed, still standing in the same place. She had brushed off some dirt, coughed slightly, and then casually complained about the mess the sudden attack had caused. Hyrie had narrowed her eyes, the realization sinking in. Her most powerful spell had accomplished nothing. She had muttered her disbelief, acknowledging aloud that the full ability enhancement granted by the contract seal had rendered her strongest magic ineffective. Apu's grin had only widened at this. She had declared that she was truly angry now and, with a sudden burst of speed, launched herself toward Hyrie. Hyrie had reacted quickly, casting barrier creation, raising massive boulders from the earth to encase herself and the others in a protective shell. But Apu hadn't been deterred in the slightest. As she had approached, she had proclaimed the barrier useless, her voice echoing with confidence. She had then executed her next move, Exploding Demon Fist, which had shattered the stone barrier completely. As the debris from the broken barrier had crumbled around them, Apu had stood amidst the ruin, smiling wildly, victorious even against Hyrie's defensive magic. But Hyrie had stood firm. Drawing on her remaining strength, she had unleashed one last powerful incantation, Freezing Sacred Stigmata. Streams of divine energy had surged from her fingertips, striking Apu directly. However, as the brilliant light faded, Apu had remained completely unfazed. With a playful tone, she had commented on how close the attack had come and had even recognized the spell by name. She had remarked that only the great sage herself could wield such ancient magic, then corrected herself with a mocking smirk, calling Hyri the former great sage. At that, Hyri's legs had buckled beneath her, and she had dropped to her knees, trembling. Her magic had been spent. She had stared at her hands, unable to believe how empty they felt. Her voice had wavered as she acknowledged, with disbelief, that her power was completely gone. Apu had looked down at her with disappointment, the thrill of battle quickly fading. She had scoffed at the pathetic state of the once great mage and mused aloud that perhaps Hyri's strength had only been temporarily restored by a magic stone. Regardless of the truth, she had declared that it no longer mattered, and told Hyri to die. But before finishing her off, Apu had leaned forward with a smirk and said she would share something interesting, something she claimed to have also told the Fairy King. A flashback had played in Hyri's mind. She had seen Elva kneeling before the 10 demons, Apu standing over her, speaking in a low, calculated voice. Apu had asked if Elva was truly content with her situation, the regret of her fallen comrades, the shame of her defeat. She had spoken of the deep, furious emotion Elva carried and had questioned whether Elva would continue to suppress it. She had urged her to embrace that rage, claiming that it was fitting for a demon kin. She had told Elva the demon lord would be pleased, and that with her latent power, as one of the Frakin, a warrior race, she would be enough. Returning to the present, Apu had burst into hysterical laughter. Then she had admitted she had only been joking. She had called Elva as dumb as a bug, mocking her as easily manipulated. She had ridiculed the fairy kin, claiming they were numerous and made perfect pawns. She had added that Hyri, as an elfkin, surely understood that better than anyone. Hyri had shouted back at her in fury, her body trembling as she accused Apu of toying with her best friend. Apu had looked at her, delighted by the expression on her face, and said it was perfect, that she was definitely worth killing. Meanwhile, Kotarou, still suspended in the air, had clenched his fists, his fury boiling over as he listened to every word Apu had spoken. Apu stood over Hyri, a twisted grin stretching across her face as she savored the frustration etched in her opponent's expression. With a manic gleam in her eyes, she announced her intent to send Hyri to the grave. Hyri, trembling with rage, cursed Apu, calling her a demon kin. But Apu only seemed more delighted, relishing every moment of Hyri's helpless fury. As she gathered a surge of power to unleash her signature technique, Exploding Demon Fist, she looked eager to hear Hyri's final scream. Just as she launched the devastating blow, a blur of motion shot between them. Kotarou had intervened. He intercepted the attack mid-strike, catching Apu's fist in his own. The suddenness of his arrival stunned everyone. Apu stared, wide-eyed, in disbelief that her blow had been stopped so easily. The atmosphere shifted as Kotarou fixed a piercing glare on her, his presence exuding an aura so dangerous that Apu involuntarily shrieked. Without a word, Kotarou activated a technique ninjutsu redirection. The energy from Apu's attack was reflected back at her, the sheer force tearing her body apart and scattering her into bloodied chunks. Hyri, watching in awe, whispered in disbelief at what had just occurred. Internally, Kotarou reflected on the moment. Killing had defined his life. He had always believed himself to be nothing but a cold, emotionless weapon. But now, something within him had changed. He hadn't wanted to lose her. A new feeling stirred, strange and unfamiliar, sympathy, perhaps even affection. Tears slipped down his face as he questioned whether he still possessed a human heart. Apu's shredded body still twitched, barely clinging to life. She muttered in disbelief, trying to understand how Kotarou's technique had bypassed the full body protection granted by her demon contract seal. Hyri realized the truth. Kotarou's ninjutsu wasn't of this world. It ignored enhancements, breaking through even the strongest seals. Despite her broken state, Apu chuckled darkly and cast a full stamina recovery spell. Her body rapidly began to heal, flesh and bone restoring before their eyes. With perverse joy, she declared her affection for Kotarou, saying she saw the same darkness in his eyes, the despair, loneliness, and hatred of someone who had killed countless times. She insisted that he belonged with the demon kin, with the demon lord himself. She invited him to join them to rule the world by her side. Kotarou hesitated as her words echoed in his thoughts. He reflected on the brutal truth of life. The strong ruled the weak. That hadn't changed from the world he once knew. Then, with a mocking smirk, he stuck out his tongue and laughed, rejecting her offer. Apu laughed back at him, amused, but her expression soon shifted to pure rage. Her body began to mutate and grow, transforming into a massive, monstrous form. She vowed to take him by force and declared that she would beat him into submission, even if it meant nearly killing him. As energy surged around her, Hairi stared in horror at the sheer intensity of her power. This was the true strength of one of the 10 demon generals. Apu gathered her strength and prepared to strike once more, announcing exploding demon fist, full release. Just before she attacked, she swore to make Kotarou submit through overwhelming might. Hairi, terrified, believed not even Kotarou's technique could endure a blow of that scale. She screamed at him to run, but Kotarou raised his hand calmly, blocking the blow head-on. The earth beneath him cracked violently from the pressure, but he didn't move. Apu was left speechless. Then, once more, Kotarou activated redirection. Her own overwhelming power was turned against her. The resulting explosion completely destroyed her body. As the dust settled, Hairi stared at Kotarou in stunned silence. He stood alone, defiant and unmoving. With quiet resolve, he declared that he hated those who ruled by fear, especially those who thought themselves gods. After defeating Apu, Kotarou stood silently for a moment, his body swaying slightly as exhaustion took over. His eyelids grew heavy, and it was clear he could barely remain conscious. Hairi rushed to his side and embraced him tightly. She thanked him for saving them and urged him to rest, her voice full of gratitude and relief. In response, Kotarou slowly closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep in her arms. Nearby, Elva lay on the ground, watching with a faint, weak smile. She let out a soft chuckle, amazed that a human child had managed to destroy one of the 10 demons with a single blow. When Hairi noticed she was alive, she immediately moved to heal her. But Elva stopped her, explaining gently that there was no point, her time had come. She told Hairi that without the contract seal, her body would begin to decay, as she had already lived far beyond her limit. Elva spoke with a calm, reflective tone, lamenting how the fairy kin had overreached, seeking strength they were never meant to possess. She admitted they could never surpass the elf kin in any way. Still, she told Hairi her journey wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. She warned that pursuers would soon come, and the demon kin would stop at nothing to get their hands on the baby. With her last strength, Elva extended her hand and released a burst of magic. She called it her parting gift. Hairi looked down and discovered that she was now wearing a pair of enchanted winged boots, S-rank equipment known as the fairy boots. Elva explained that the boots would triple her speed, grant brief levitation, and make her harder to detect by enemies. Hairi marveled at how light her body had suddenly become. Elva then gave her final instructions. If Hairi had nowhere else to go, she should travel far east, past the Warlord Mountains, to a place called Hydrat. It was the only region left untouched by the demonic realm and served as the last bastion of resistance against the demon kin. Elva said warriors from all over the world were gathering there, and with the boy by her side, Hairi might just stand a chance. As her voice began to fade, Elva tried to finish her thought, but her body was already beginning to wither. Hairi smiled sadly through her tears and gently corrected her, saying that Kotarou wasn't just a companion. He was her equal, her friend, a true party member, just as the elfkin and fairykin once had been. She vowed to carry out their shared dream, a peaceful world where no one ruled over others. Memories of their childhood seemed to stir something in Elva's fading consciousness. A soft smile appeared on her face before her body fully dissolved into light. Her final words, filled with warmth and hope, echoed in the air, promising she would be watching from beyond. Hyrie stood motionless, tears streaming down her cheeks, and quietly wished her old friend peace. Elsewhere, the scene shifted. On the ground lay Apu's severed eye. Suddenly, a violent surge of demonic energy erupted, and her entire body regenerated. As she gasped and tried to process what had happened, fear overtook her. She realized the Demon Lord's contract seal had saved her. But even more terrifying was the fact that Kotarou had survived and countered her most powerful technique. She now understood he wasn't human, not in the normal sense. Then, a voice echoed in her mind. The Demon Lord spoke to her, his tone cold and disappointed. Apu panicked and addressed him in desperation. He reminded her how he had found her near death after her clan's destruction at the hands of humans, and how he had bestowed power upon her. But she had failed him. As the contract seal around her neck began to tighten, choking her, the Demon Lord mocked her lineage, calling the Agin a weak, inferior race. Apu begged him for another chance, insisting she had brought pain and suffering to many in his name and could still be useful. But her pleas were ignored. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed. Her body shriveled as the last of her life was drained away. Then, from the shadows of a nearby tree, a dark figure stepped forward. He chuckled softly to himself and declared that he would take all the credit. It was Ezra, another of the 10 demons. The scene shifted to Hyrie sprinting through the dense forest, her boots thudding heavily against the damp earth. Branches snapped past her, and leaves scattered behind her in the wind. She finally burst through the last line of trees and came to a sudden stop at the edge of a towering cliff. Gasping for air, she stared out over the jagged terrain below, an endless expanse known as the Warlord Mountains. Between ragged breaths, she whispered to herself that they had made it. Kotarou stirred, slowly opening his eyes, still weighed down by exhaustion. When Hyrie turned to face him, her expression softened with concern and quiet triumph. She told him they had reached the Warlord Mountains, explaining that this was once the battlefield where the hero's party had clashed with the Demon Lord. The war, she said, still raged on, unceasing, day and night. She added that beyond those mountains lay Hydrat, the royal capital, and the last bastion untouched by demon influence. As she fell silent, her thoughts drifted to Miria. Hyrie believed the hero was still out there, still fighting. Then she looked back at Kotarou with renewed determination, telling him that the people of Hydrat were waiting for strong individuals like him. The scene then cut to a battlefield engulfed in chaos, scarred by flame, drenched in blood. Warriors from Hydrat were engaged in fierce combat with the demon kin. The sound of steel clashing against steel filled the air, along with cries of pain and fury. One of the demons, overwhelmed by the sheer resistance, snarled in frustration that no matter how many humans they slaughtered, more kept coming. In response, a human warrior shouted back defiantly as he charged, vowing that they would stand their ground until their last breath. Nearby, a young priestess worked desperately, pouring healing magic into a wounded soldier. The injured man grasped her robe and urged her, voice trembling, to hold on just a little longer. He believed reinforcements would come. But then, a group of demons broke through the front line and rushed toward her, shouting their intent to kill the healer and end her aid. They were nearly upon her until, in an instant, they were all cut down. A blur of motion, a flash of steel. The priestess looked up in shock. Standing before her, twin swords in hand, was a towering woman radiating fury. The wind itself seemed to swirl around her presence. One of the nearby soldiers gasped and cried out in astonishment, recognizing their savior and declaring that they were saved. It was Miria Barbados, one of the 4 great heroes. Her lip curled in disgust as she muttered that she couldn't stand the stench of the demon kin. She promised to kill every last one of them. The demons froze, fear etched into their faces. One of them stammered, recognizing her as the war god. Without a word, Miria charged forward. Her blades cleaved effortlessly through demon after demon, cutting them down like paper dolls. Elsewhere, Hyrie continued her dash across a narrow trail winding through the cliffs, completely unaware of the battle unfolding just below. As she moved past the battlefield, Miria, mid-strike, came to an abrupt halt. She wrinkled her nose and murmured that something was off. The scent of blood in the air was too thick, too overwhelming. It felt as though it clung to the soul itself. Her grip tightened on her weapons as she growled that she wouldn't let any of them escape. Then, without hesitation, she took off after the trail of blood. Eventually, she caught up. When she reached Hyrie, the girl turned, breathless but smiling, and spoke her name. Miria froze, stunned. She recognized the voice and the face, and called out Hyrie's name in disbelief. Meanwhile, another figure emerged elsewhere on the battlefield. From the smoke and shadows stepped a demon cloaked in darkness. It's Azra, one of the 10 demons. He surveyed the land with a smirk, remarking that the fugitives had indeed fled to the Warlord Mountains. To him, it was the perfect battlefield. He took a deep breath, spreading his arms wide, and declared that Kotarou should not be underestimated. That only made the hunt more exhilarating. He chuckled softly, a sinister smile curling on his lips as he promised that this time, he would kill them all. Miria was stunned as she looked at Hyrie, her voice trembling with disbelief as she demanded to know why Hyrie was there. Her eyes dropped to the infant in Hyrie's arms, her expression shifting from confusion to shock upon realizing that the child was a human baby. Before she could fully comprehend the situation, Kotarou suddenly disappeared from Hyrie's grasp and reappeared atop Miria's head, tugging relentlessly at her ears. Miria screamed in surprise, flailing as she tried to process what was happening. The sensation of his tiny hands tugging at her ears was unbearable, and she couldn't understand how he had managed to climb up there so quickly. Frustrated and bewildered, she seized Kotarou and hurled him to the ground in a fit of irritation, yelling furiously. Hyrie gasped in horror, crying out as she witnessed the baby being thrown so roughly. But before anyone could react further, violent explosions erupted around them, shaking the ground. As the dust began to settle, towering pillars of skeletons started emerging from the earth, each more grotesque than the last. Both Miria and Hyrie stood frozen in shock, staring at the horrifying spectacle. From a distance, Azra watched with amusement, quietly chuckling to himself as he observed the chaos. He reflected that this land had always been a battlefield, drenched in blood from countless wars. With tens of thousands of corpses buried beneath the soil, he began chanting an ancient necromantic spell. As he invoked the power of the dead, the skeletal army surged forward under his control. Azra reveled in the moment, laughing at what he considered the irony and hilarity of the scene, the long-dead humans now rising to kill their own. As the skeletal horde advanced, Miria launched herself into the fray. She moved with incredible speed and precision, slicing through the undead with practiced ease. As she fought, she recognized the nature of her enemies and cursed the demon kin for their constant cruelty and desecration of the dead. With a fierce cry, she unleashed a powerful technique called Fang Sword, cutting down wave after wave of skeletons. For a brief moment, silence fell across the battlefield. Then, without warning, even more skeletons burst from the earth. Hyrie, overwhelmed, began to realize that the onslaught might never end. Her face was pale, etched with fear and disbelief. Miria pressed on, slashing through the undead as she speculated aloud that someone nearby, likely a demon kin, had to be controlling them. But her deduction was cut short when she let out another startled scream. Kotarou had once again latched onto her, this time clinging tightly to her tail, seemingly enchanted by its fluffiness. Miria, completely exasperated, grabbed the child and hurled him away even more furiously than before. Her patience was gone, and she shouted in frustration, threatening to end his antics permanently. Just then, Azra made his move. With a dark grin, he launched an attack, Gatu, Hungry Blade, unleashing a deadly barrage of sharpened bones at the group. As the bones tore through the air, he boasted that they had been hardened over centuries and were capable of piercing anything. He declared his intent to kill them all, his voice filled with malicious glee. Miria's gaze snapped toward him as she caught his scent on the wind. She immediately recognized it. Uzra had finally revealed himself. His cowardice disgusted her, and she called him out for hiding in the shadows for so long. But Uzra remained unfazed. He taunted her, mocking her anger and calling humans nothing more than toys for the demon kin. He claimed that if the demon lord had truly wished to, he could have destroyed Hydrat in a single night. To him, it was all amusing, a twisted source of pleasure. Miria raised her swords to block the incoming attack, but the sheer force of the assault overwhelmed her. One of her blades snapped under the pressure, the broken steel falling from her hand as she stared in disbelief. In that moment, Kotarou floated silently into the air before her, effortlessly defying gravity. Miria froze, sensing something strange, something powerful. Her nose wrinkled as she caught a scent far more intense than Hyri's. The overwhelming stench of blood wasn't coming from her companion. It clung to the soul, heavy and unnatural. It was coming from Kotarou. Suddenly, she understood. This was no ordinary child. As for Kotarou, he looked upon the skeletal army with utter disdain. To him, necromancy was a parlor trick, nothing more than a cheap display. With a simple motion, he raised a hand and invoked a technique few dared to use. Fuuma's 12 Forbidden Arts. From deep within the underworld, something ancient stirred as he summoned a force beyond mortal comprehension.